Lindsey Williams. He's been a writer all his life, a journalist, syndicated in 24 papers, columnist now in his semi-retirement for the Daily Herald News of Charlotte County. I laugh when I say semi-retirement because when I hear his schedule, I don't think he's retired at all. Sounds like he must be working harder now than he did when he was.
And being paid less.
Aren't we all? He's doing this as a favor for us. He is most noted for his writing on history and archaeology. And for that, he has received the Freedom Foundation George Washington Medal. He's the author of 3 histories and very active in the Rotary Club, too, in the district and county. Come on in. Newest book, Boldly Onward. And Lindsey will tell you about this. It's about the Spanish explorations that took place right around us. That's the amazing thing, that we can tie this into our own neighborhood. Lindsey Williams.
Thank you, Mary, and I want to also thank you for inviting me. This is a nostalgic journey for me because I at one time had a condo apartment at Sanibel down on the southern part of the island, and I dearly loved it. It was at a very hectic period in my life when I was publishing 7 newspapers, and it kept me kind of busy. And when I came across that causeway and got onto this island, it was much less inhabited than it is now. It was a turn off entirely from all the hassles of the newspaper business, and I could completely relax down here. And so I dearly loved Sanibel. When I did retire, I thought I was retiring, semi-retiring, for a number of reasons, mostly involving boating. I wanted to have a home on Charlotte Harbor, so I moved up to Punta Gorda. But at any rate, I sure am enjoying my trip here. I came a little early deliberately so I could drive around, and I'm astonished at the growth that's still going on. When I came here in '72, it was still pretty much a small community, and it's very large now. And the library, for instance, is doubled in size. This is the little library when I came here. I've got to tell you a story about the library, how much I appreciate the library, and not only this one, but all of them. I do a lot of research in libraries, and mostly in the Library of Congress, which is absolutely the world's best. But this book started in this library. I came down here for my first vacation in '72, and because I am interested in history, I went to the library here to get some history about Sanibel Island. One of the books that I ran across was a little volume called DeSoto Didn't Land in Tampa by Shell, and lives over in Fort Myers. And I read the book, and I said, well, he made a good case that he didn't land in Tampa, but he didn't make a very good case that he landed in Caloosahatchee River either. I think I'll just look up a few things. Well, that turned out to be a 12-year job. It took me 2 years to research the book, and it took a year then to write it. These are all in my leisure time, of course, and another year to rewrite it, and then it took me 8 years to find a publisher. So it takes a lot longer to find a publisher than it does to actually write the book. But this little book that I got out of the library here, and then several others that I got over the years to supplement my research, started me off on this book. On that first vacation, not only did I get this little book that convinced me that nobody really knew where DeSoto landed, I also received the current issue of the National Geographic, which I brought down here to fill in the cracks of my leisure time. And it so happened that they have excellent cartography, and a couple of key landmarks in the work in the research I was doing on DeSoto fitted the map that I saw in the National Geographic. And all of a sudden I thought, well, it had to be at Charlotte Harbor, and that's what the book's about. But at any rate, enough nostalgia. I want to talk today about the role of Sanibel in the early history of Florida. Sanibel is the beginning of American history. Not many people realize that. this was the front door of America at one time. And unfortunately, that aspect of American history has been pretty much neglected, overshadowed by the Plymouth colony and stepping ashore on Plymouth Rock and all that sort of thing. So I hope that I can give you a little insight on how important this area is to the very earliest history of this nation. The history has to start, of course, with Ponce de Leon, and he came here in 1513 to, quote, discover Florida. Actually, somebody discovered Florida about 1500 or 1501, and we have maps, and they're in the book, and I'll show you one here very shortly, that demonstrates that somebody came to Florida and coasted both eastern and western shores and mapped it very well and named all the principal inlets and harbors. Ponce de Leon is accorded the honor of being the discoverer simply because he held an asiento, a contract with the crown, that gave him permission to settle the country. And he was called an adelantado, not a conquistador, as most people say. The first four explorers to come to this area were adelantados. That's an official title bestowed by the crown. It means those who go boldly onward. That's where we got the title. Objective of an adelantado was to pacify and colonize. So Ponce de Leon got an asiento to come here and colonize Florida. He was the first, 1513. He came here, and I'm going to explain how he got here, and then from there on, after Ponce de Leon in 1513 and again in 1521, he was followed by a man named Panfilio Narvaez, but we think he landed up at Tampa Bay. But then he was followed by Hernando de Soto in 1539, and then by Pedro Menendez de Avilas in 1565 on the East Coast and 1566 over here. Well, with that little bit of background, let me show you a few things that will bring you into perspective. Excuse me, I'm going to sit over here. If it burns out, then I'm on my own. First of all, I want to point out that when the Europeans first came to Florida, the Florida was divided into two general tribal or ethnic groups. One was the Calusa on the southern tip of Florida, and the other was the Tamaqua north of that. The dividing line between the two, strangely enough, went through the middle of Charlotte Harbor. The Calusa did not occupy the northern shore. It did occupy everything on the southern shore and all the way over to the east coast. So in this area, we're talking about the Calusa. This is just a few pictures out of the book showing you how the Indians, both the Tamaqua and the Calusa, lived in those days. Their culture was very, very close, although they had a different dialect. They lived in stockades. This is where the Americans got the idea for building stockades when they came to settle this country. They worshiped the sun. Their principal ceremony was a festival in the spring, which was highlighted by singing and dancing around a stuffed deer. They were very warlike people. They practiced infant murder. The firstborn child was always killed, had his head smashed. This is a ceremony where the firstborn infant of the woman kneeling there crying, and one of her friends is bringing up her baby and they're getting ready to kill it. This is a war council of the Aborigine. They must be getting ready to go to war, because when they got ready to fight the night before, they would drink black drink, a purgative, which would empty their bellies and their intestines. So if they suffered a belly wound, they would not get peritonitis. They were very warlike. they're the ones who practiced scalping. This is where the other Indians of the nation got the idea for scalping. It originated with the Calusa. Their trophies were the scalp, and they always wore their hair in a top knot so that their enemies could grasp them easily and scalp them. Their other trophies were the legs and the arms, which they carried back home and barbecued them and ate them. They practiced ritual cannibalism. This is the very first map of the Spanish era, made in 1500 by Juan La Cosa, who was a navigator on Columbus's second voyage. You can see that that Cuba and Puerto Rico are very well delineated, and there's an indication that there is land north, but of course it does not show any Florida peninsula. This is the map that I told you about that was made in 1502, so it had to have been, the information had to be gathered in 1901, or 1501 or 1500. This was, it's called the Cantino map. Cantino actually was the Duke of Ferrara in Italy, and he sent his agent to Portugal, to Lisbon, to buy some mules. So he said, while you're there, see if you can get me a map of the New World that everyone's been talking about. And this is the map that that agent then procured for his employer. The interesting thing about it is that it's a pretty good job at this stage of the game of mapping Florida. And he named, whoever wrote this, drew this map, named most of the places that are prominent today. But they are names which are not too familiar to us. The Mosquito River and the White River and the Peaceful River, things are rather generic term. There is one curious, very specific name, however, and it's a mystery we haven't been able to solve, and all of us have been looking for a long time, and that is the very tip of Florida is called the last day of April Cape. So somebody turned the corner in this, when they were making this map on the April the 30th, 1501 or 1500. We don't know who this is. This was a Portuguese map, which means that it was illegal. The Spaniards had been given the right by the Pope to own all of the New World except the very tip of Brazil, and were told to stay out of this country. So this is a bootleg map, obviously made by a Portuguese. But who it was, we don't know. Well, at any rate, this is just another map. This is the so-called the Admiral's map. This is a map that is attributed to Columbus because it names down in the Spanish Main, the northern coast of South America, it names some places that Columbus had just discovered and named. This is another map showing that there was, at this time, this is 1511 map, this indicates that they had a vague notion of the Keys. You can see the Keys are kind of misplaced. They run all the way from Cuba to the southern tip of what is Florida. And here is a very a specific landmark, the Marquesas Keys, which Ponce de Leon visited, and he called Turtle Island or La Tortugas. That Tortugas got displaced when there was a big wreck here, when the Atocha went down, and the Marquis of Mexico came here to supervise it, so they always call it the Marquis Island, or the Marquesas. That's how it got its name. Now, talk about Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon then knew very well that Florida was here, and he had a pretty good idea where it was. So he set out to colonize it. And there's been a dispute about where did Ponce de Leon land. The consensus has been that he landed somewhere near St. Augustine, and they even have a fountain up there they call the Ponce de Leon fountain, and for a couple of bucks you can get a jug of spring water to make you young again. And I guess you will if you believe it. At any rate, the principal contribution I've made to this controversy about Ponce de Leon and De Soto's landing place, which has been going on for about 4 centuries, I disagree with the consensus, and that's what the book's about. The principal contribution that I've made 2 principal contributions. One was to go back to original sources. When I write history, I try to go back to the very beginning. I try to avoid basing my conclusions on secondary sources. And so in my case, I went back to original documents in Spanish. And the other grand contribution that I made to this question is that of determining the hydrology of the expeditions. And no one had done this before. In the brief account of Ponce de Leon, his journals were lost, and we only have a notary's copy of them, and he kind of picked and chose about what he wrote about. But what we do have available does give some rather specific information about the latitudes and longitudes, which are completely erroneous, because they didn't have the equipment in those days to compute latitude and longitudes accurately. But they are very specific about distances and depths. And in Ponce de Leon's journal, he said that they came to land 1 league from shore in 9 fathoms of water. They dropped anchor in 9 fathoms. Now, the distance from shore, the depth of the water, and the composition of the sea bottom at that spot is those 3 things constitute a fingerprint. They're very seldom duplicated exactly that way. So if we're able to find places which fit those 3 criteria, we have a rather specific place. Ponce came to anchor 1 league from shore, 9 fathoms of water. It occurs in only 2 places on the east coast. And it occurs right here and right here. Now, he says that when he came to anchor in 9 fathoms, he went ashore, took possession. The next day he sailed northward a little ways and then turned south. If he had landed at this spot, he could not have sailed northward without getting into shallows. So to me it's rather obvious that when he sailed north, he turned around at shortly north of Ormond by the Sea, which is kind of north of Daytona Beach. And then he started to sail around the whole peninsula. And this represents his route as I have been able to compute it from the documents. And he finally gets down to this point and turns north and sails due north. They did not understand in those days that the Earth's magnetic field varied from place to place. And I was able, with some friends who are navigators, who teach navigation, to back up for me to 1513 to see what the magnetic variation was at that time. And it was roughly a 1.5 degrees east. So if you sail straight north by magnetic compass, you're actually varying a little bit to the east. And then I compute, therefore, that he came to shore someplace north of Charlotte Harbor and sailed past it. Now, he was looking for a harbor where he could start a colony. But it's very difficult to spot the opening to Charlotte Harbor. It's very narrow. And De Soto had the same problem a few years later. He sailed past it. He finally did find, quote, a way between the islands and the mainland. And he entered it and anchored. And he anchored right off Sanibel Island. He stayed there 10 days, trying to make contact with the Calusa. They wouldn't have anything to do with him. They came out on 2 occasions and shot arrows at him. And as a matter of fact, they killed 1 Spaniard. But he declined to go ashore and chase after them. Probably a very wise move, as we'll see later. And eventually sailed out through San Carlos Bay and started home. And On his way home, he stopped at an island which they named Tortugas because there were a lot of turtles there, and they killed them and had some fresh meat. And there's the marked places. Well, at any rate, this is the most interesting map of Florida because it's the first one to use the name Florida, or place of flowers. Ponce de Leon came here during the Easter season, and in Spain in those days, the Easter season lasted, was a 2-week period, and it was called the celebration of flowers. And that's why he named it Florida when he got here. The interesting thing about it is that this map was made by Fraducci in 1515, so this is just a year or two, less than 2 years after Ponce came here, and he does a pretty good job of outlining the part of Florida which he visited. This is an interesting feature, so it's so large. This is Jupiter Inlet. That is not at all that prominent, but this was a common practice in those days. If there was an important landmark, you made it very large on your map so nobody would miss it. So we know he got to Jupiter Inlet, and I describe all his stops all the way along here. Here are the outer islands. The interesting thing about it is that Ponce stopped short. There's the end of the line. He did not get into Charlotte Harbor. This is pretty good proof. Now he does have 2 names here that indicate, one of them is Carlos, which indicates that he had made contact with the Calusa Indians who occupied Pine Island Sound, Sanibel Island, Pine Island, and the main one, of course, opposite Pine Island Sound. Now, these are maps we won't spend a lot of time on. I really want to tell you about this story. You know, we have this wonderful story about when the Jamestown was founded. Captain John Smith was the military commander of that, and he got captured by the Powhatan, the chief, and we were going to kill him, and Pocahontas ran and threw herself over him and said, why don't you spare him? And her father said, well, okay, I guess I'll spare him. Beautiful story, but it didn't happen. It did happen here, in this area, by the Indian princess. We don't know her name, but her father did capture a Spaniard named Ortiz, a young man, very handsome, and she convinced they were going to barbecue him. And this is one of the words that we've inherited from the Calusa, barbecue. And as a matter of fact, they had him on the grill and were doing a pretty good job of roasting him when she finally convinced her father that it'd be a pretty good idea to have a white slave. And so he said, okay, pull him off. And they doctored him up with bear grease, and he did recover and was captive among the Calusa for 13 years until he was rescued by De Soto in 1539. He had been shipwrecked there. Well, at any rate, the story, the Pocahontas story, properly belongs to this area, not to Jamestown. Now, these are maps I'm going to hurry through. This is a map of Tampa. The interesting thing here is the depths of the water. This is the first map that's available showing depths of water in Tampa. Showing that it has a mouth 6 miles wide, and it has 25 feet over the bar and 30 and 40 feet inside. It's a good deep harbor. This is the harbor at Charlotte Harbor, and it had 50 feet over the bar. Right there, there's the bar, 50 feet over the bar, and it went to 20 feet inside and then shelved off rapidly to finally gets up to 12 feet about up in here. And that's important to determine De Soto's landing place. And I'll speak about that. This is a map which was drawn between 1859 and 1563, showing the first real good hydrology of Charlotte Harbor. And it has a lot to do both with
Ponce de Leon and with Hernando de Soto. I believe that Ponce de Leon came through here, anchored here, made his way down here, and on his second trip probably came ashore at Sanibel. I do believe, however, that he made his his attempt to colonize the country. The very first attempt to colonize was made at Pine Island, at the very tip. Occupied that for about 4 months, where he was attacked and took an arrow in a place of his anatomy where he was never able to sit down and eat his dinner anymore. Gangrene set in, and the whole colony rushed back to Havana to take care of him, and he died there. So the first attempt to establish a colony in America was made at the southern tip of Pine Island, and but was aborted after 4 months. When De Soto came in 1539, I believe that he made landfall here. This is Sanibel. This bulge in the west coast of Florida is the landmark from the very beginning. This is, if you do sail due north of the Boca Grande Channel through the Keys, and you have the 1 degree variation east, this is what you come up against. You come up against Sanibel. So it's been a landmark for a long time. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that, just a little bit. I only show this, and this is a map that I reversed so that the details show up a little sharper. It's only interesting here because when De Soto landed, I'm going to back up here. When De Soto found the landmark here, he knew where he was going to go. He'd sent out a scout the winter before, and they were trying to find a specific place. They got to this point, they didn't recognize him. So De Soto got into a boat with a couple of his men and made their way through San Carlos Bay, up past Sanibel, and up through the Pine Island Sound, got up into this area. Oh yeah, here we are. And but he couldn't sail back. They had a wind from the south, so he could sail in, but he couldn't turn around and come back. So he spent the night there. And he spent the night at an abandoned Indian village. The next day, he made his way out through this opening, Boca Grande Pass, and he was observed the next morning by his captains, his fleet, who by this time had moved out, because they were about to be blown ashore by the south wind. They saw him laboring to come up, that is tacking. So they sailed downwind to him. He stationed a ship at each tip of the flying bar and guided the ships in. And they sailed in under their own power, and they got in here and anchored and then walked the beach for a day. They were attacked that night. The next day, they came over and unloaded here, in my opinion, the army and the cavalry, and the army and the cavalry then marched up this way. The fleet then had to kedge its way up the harbor. That is, carry out its anchor in a small boat, drop it, and then the ship pull up on its own anchor with a windlass. It took them 3 to 5 days, depending upon which of the early narratives is most accurate. Some say 3, some say 5. De Soto himself said 5, so De Soto ought to know. Took them 5 days. Now that's very difficult. Why in the world would they take a fleet into strange waters, a place they would have great difficulty in maneuvering in? The channel there is very narrow. And they worked their way very steadily up into the harbor. This is why, one of the reasons why I think De Soto landed in this area, because all of the narratives, including De Soto's own, they emphasize the difficulty in finding the mouth of the harbor. They scraped the bottom going in, but as it was mud, they passed on. They then took 3 or 4 days to work their way up into a place which had been very difficult for them to get out of, if they'd had any difficulties. And finally still didn't reach the place where they were going, which was an Indian village named Osita. They finally had, they unloaded the men and the horses here, and it took the ships on up. By here they're up to about 12 feet, which was not even deep enough for their heaviest laden ships, in my opinion, after my research on old 16th century sailing vessels. They did, narratives say they did have to unload and put in the small boats and carry the supplies the last 2 leagues, about 5 miles, to the town of Osita. Very strange maneuver. If we knew the reason why DeSoto chose that place to land and spend that much effort and that much risk in doing it, we'd know a lot more about the history of Florida than we do now. Hopefully someday we'll find it. Well, at any rate, this is kind of what got me off the side, got me sidetracked, because I want to tell you about some mounds. Betty will be interested in this. She's dug some mounds up at Pine Island. Now I'll show you some of those mounds on this old map, Betty. At any rate, on the southern tip of Gasparilla Island, there were 5 very large mounds until, about 50 years ago, when they were leveled to make a fill for a phosphate dock. Well, it'll be a little more than 50 years ago. It'll be almost 100 years ago, when they leveled it to make a phosphate dock here. But there are the 5 mounds, and this could very well be the abandoned Indian village that DeSoto spent the night at in his first time ashore. Here is a very large mound at the northern tip of La Costa, and here is Yusepa Island, and that is one long mound. The whole length of that island is one long mound, and it goes back 5,000 years. Dr. Marquardt, who Betty and I have had the pleasure of working with, did some excavations there several years ago, and found artifacts and skeletons going back 3,000 BC. This also was Tampa. This was believed to be the capital of the Calusa Nation, and it was called Tampa, T-O-A-M-P-E. And it was called Tampa up until about 1824. It shows on a map of 1824. And that's the name that got displaced from here all the way up to Tampa and gave Tampa Bay its name. Now how that happened is kind of an interesting story. You have to know a little bit about cartography, and I explained that. But anyway, this was a very large Calusa Indian village, and it probably was their capital. There's one other place where that might have been their capital. Betty, this is it. Here is the Pine Island mounds. They're still there. You can go up and look at them today. They've even cut a road through them, and they've got a pretty good job of giving you a cross-section view of a mound. There's some homes on there now, and Dr. Marquardt has been digging up there, what, 3 years, did you say, Betty? Is that our 4th one coming up? This will probably be the last one. He's found a lot of interesting history. This was a ceremonial center for the Calusa, and it might have been a capital, as well as that at Yusepa. There is a canal which the Calusa dug from this ceremonial center straight across the island, all the way to Matlacha. And about a quarter mile in, there are 2 very large ceremonial mounds, which Dr. Marquardt hopes to excavate in this year. And they are amongst the largest mounds in Florida. So they're extremely significant. There's another very large mound right there. And that mound is very, very high. And the early settlers who came here remarked about it. The very high white bluff that you could see on your right once you got inside the harbor. It was white because when the Indians lived there and took care of it, they placed whelk shells butt side out into the face of the mound. So it was a very striking, gleaming white earthwork in those days. There's a house up there now, private home, beautiful view of the harbor, I'm sure. Well, at any rate, I thought some of you who are interested in archaeology might like to see this old map of some of the mounds which we know about today and just beginning to excavate. This is a map of some the old Indian trails that were here when a man named Williams, no relation, came through about 1821 and made maps. And we know that De Soto followed Indian trails whenever possible. He had been on the expedition, he was the number 2 man on the expedition with Pizarro in Peru. And he knew very well the importance of following Indian trails and not striking out in the lush jungle of a place like Peru and Florida. And that's a critical point in understanding where he landed and his route. Now, on De Soto, in addition to the hydrology, I went back and got the original documents of the 4 people who wrote accounts of the expedition. One of them was a man named Louis Biedma, who was the king's factor. He was sent along to make sure that the king got 1/5 of all the treasure they expected to find. They didn't find any. De Soto found only death on the banks of the Mississippi 4 years after landing. But anyway, this is the original manuscript. This is a copy I've obtained from the Library of Congress, who obtained their copy from the Historical Museum at Madrid. This is the original manuscript of Biedma. And he says that after they landed and they began their march inland, that they took their way Caminando en la Via del Poniente towards D-E and E-L are contracted here, toward the Poniente. Most of the interpreters have always said that this meant toward the west. And some of them say that it meant from the west. This is a big argument that I've been having with the professional historians of Florida now for ever since I wrote the book. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I contend, and they say that it was either meant from the west, or this was a typographical error, and he really meant towards the east. Because if you're on the west shore of Tampa Bay, as this is the official version of the historians, that he landed at Ruskin and made his camp at Ruskin. If you start out from Ruskin to march west, you're going to probably drown. We know that Biedma says that they took their way toward Poniente, which means the place where the sun sets. So it means slightly northwest. And they marched one day, Poniente, toward the setting sun, till he reached the river of Mococa, which I believe is a corruption of Macaca. Macaca is a corruption of Mococo. And there was an Indian chief who lived there, and he was Tamaqua. And he was the only one who was friendly with De Soto. And De Soto liked him and didn't attack him. And after they reached the river of Mococa, they turned northeast, and they came to 2 lakes, one of which was the home of Chief Mococa, and then from there made their way up the spine of Florida and then towards the Mississippi. I take the position that these people said what they meant. I take the position that Biedma meant they took their way towards the setting sun, that it was not a typographical error, and we didn't have to warp the grammar of the Spanish in order to satisfy someone's theory. In the case of De Soto, if you make your way up to the head of Charlotte Harbor and land and De Soto said he landed on a cape. He made his camp on a cape. There is a cape up there called Live Oak Point, which is the approach to the bridge across the harbor. And I believe then when he set out, he started marching toward the west. And you march about one day northwest from Live Oak Point, and you come to the Mayaca River, and you turn northeast on the Mayaca River, and you come to Lower and Upper Lake Mayaca. So the hydrology and the landmarks and the original documents all fit. We don't have to make any excuses or any apologies or make up some theory about why they were wrong. If you just say, hey, they said what they meant, And the only place that it fits is Charlotte Harbor. Well, this is the story of DeSoto. And I'm going to mention that because it's important to Sanibel. DeSoto says, or the narrators say, that they came to anchor 2 leagues from shore in 4 fathoms of water. That is very shallow water. And all 4 of the narrators comment about that. So it must have been an important fact. And they anchored in sand. Now here again, as on the East Coast, there are only 2 places where this can occur. And one of them is right off Point Bell. And this black area is 3.5 to 4 fathoms. And here is the 2-fathom line right there. And I believe that's an anchor. I believe that's where they anchored. There's only one other spot, again, on the west coast of Florida, where that combination occurs. 2 leagues from shore, 4 fathoms of water, white sand bottom. And that is north of Tampa Bay. Narvaez went to Tampa Bay, so DeSoto knew where it was. And he didn't want to go there. He wanted to go, for some reason, he wanted to go to Charlotte Harbor. He would have had no difficulty in finding the 6-mile wide entrance to Tampa Bay, nor having any difficulty in sailing over the bar and sailing all the way up the Tampa Bay without having to kedge. The fact that he came into shallow water and could occur then logically only at this place, right off this Point Bell. He made his way up what I've described in here, came up, landed here, went up here. Here's Live Oak Point, marched towards the setting sun to Myakka River here, and there's lower Lake Myakka, and there's upper Lake Myakka. There's the complete route in Florida, as I compute it. We'll stop with the slides here, and I'll tell you a little bit now about Ponce de Leon and the landing place and all that sort of thing. This theory, which began in this library, how long ago? A long time ago, 72. That's almost, that's 18 years ago, isn't it? 19? It's a long time ago.
19.
And I've had to debate this question with the professors of the various universities in Florida. They're pretty well committed that Ponce de Leon landed not in this area, but landed up in the northern part of Charlotte Harbor, and that DeSoto didn't land in Charlotte Harbor at all, he landed in Tampa. But Bob Graham, when he was the governor, appointed a commission, DeSoto Trail Commission, to settle this question once and for all. And I heard that they were doing that, and I had this book that was printed by them, and just printed. So I called up the man who was in charge of it, a man named Michael Gannon, who is a professor of history at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and said, I'd like to come up and present my theory about where DeSoto landed. Well, he said, we'll call you. Never heard. I called once. Well, you know, we'll have you up. Finally, I saw in the paper that that next week, on a Wednesday, the commission was going to announce that it had studied this thing for 2 years and had decided that DeSoto had landed at Ruskin, and they were going to announce the route the next Wednesday. And I was pretty upset because they hadn't heard from me yet, so I called the Secretary of State, under whose jurisdiction this commission operated. It happened to be someone of my political party, and I happened to know him a little bit, and I told him about it. He said, that's not right. He said, stay by your phone, I'll call you back. Called back in about an hour, and he said, you come up next Wednesday at 9 o'clock, and you'll be able to present your theory. Well, this was, I went up, and walked in the room, and the commission was meeting there, and there were all eminent scholars and archaeologists, historians, and they had a big map on the wall, Florida, and there was the route which they had chosen. Hadn't heard from me yet, but started at Ruskin. Well, I knew this going in. This was a political matter because they're trying to preserve the history of Tampa.
And I expected that, so it didn't really upset me. I took a copy of my book, gave every commission member a copy, and spoke for 45 minutes, leading them through pretty much as I'm leading you through, except I'm talking only about DeSoto. And they listened very courteously, and when I finished, I thanked them, and they said, very well. And I started to gather up my papers, and one of the professors said, well, Williams, you're dead wrong. DEL in 16th century Spanish means from, not toward. And I vote that we accept the Ruskin route. And somebody said real quick, I second it. I'm still gathering up papers. And Professor Gannon happens to be an open-minded gentleman. I've got to say that. And he was totally embarrassed. Well, he says, is there any further discussion? None. They said, all in favor say aye. And everybody said aye, and I won. Well, 6 months later, I got a handwritten note from Professor Gannon. It says, Dear Lynn, upon further consideration, the Commission has decided that, oh, instead, they're going to spend $2.5 million placing plaques on this route. So they said, Dear Lynn, upon further consideration, the Commission has decided they also will place a plaque at Live Oak Point saying some scholars believe DeSoto landed in this vicinity. Big victory. That satisfies me. I think essentially, well, I had the pleasure since then of other scholars and archaeologists who've read the books that, hey, I think you're right. Well, at any rate, I thought you might like to know that in the realm of scholarship, academia, there are hurdles which you have to overcome if you're going to present a new idea. This is a completely new idea. It rewrites Florida history, early Florida history. So that's, I think, I have made that small contribution. Well, that's been a long story. I want to call your attention to something because you're from Sanibel. I made a note of this. I do point out the role of Sanibel in all this early history. And I guess I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 references. But I wanted to call your attention particularly to this particular reference because I think it goes to, and I hope you won't be upset. But remember, I'm an old Sanibelian myself, so after studying this, okay, landing place of Ponce de Leon. Was he unset? We know that he landed on an island. He said, I go back to that island to colonize it. And a lot of people have said, really, that it wasn't Sanibel. I believe not Sanibel, for reasons which I explained. There was not sufficient water here. There was not sufficient cover. It was a treeless island back in those days. Had a few cabbage palms, and that was about all. So I say this. Sanibel Islanders perpetuate a legend that Ponce's colony was on their spot, allegedly called San Ibel, or Saint Isabella. After her death, the Spanish queen of the Inquisition was sometimes referred to as Our Lady in Heaven. She died before Ponce's Florida's voyages, but it is supposed he appreciated her sponsorship of Columbus, who brought him to the New World. The word San, S-A-N, was used more to indicate saint-like or exalted, in contrast to the formal Santo or Santa, or their abbreviation ST period. Important mortals often were accorded the respectful salutation San, as discussed in chapter 15. And there we talk about an admiral who commissioned that map of Tampa that I told you about, and he was referred to as Sanibel. He was an admiral, Sir Blas, I guess, B-L-A-S. If Ponce gave Sanibel Island its name, a more likely inspiration was his daughter, Isabel. Sanibel is the natural landfall for voyages from Havana, and surely was noticed by Soto, whose wife also was named Isabel. So it took its name from one of those three ladies. I guess you can take your choice. But it was a prominent place both to Ponce and to DeSoto. The first maps name it S. period, Nibel, N-I-B-E-L, sometimes N-I-V-E-L, which translates to south level, an apt description for an island that sits low and had few trees before Malaysian palms and Australian casuarinas were introduced. An undated 18th century map, which appears to this author to have been drawn about 1755, gives Rio Sanibel. That's the first mention we have of Sanibel, is 1755, and it is applied not to this island, but is applied to the Caloosahatchee River. This raises the possibility the name Sanibel is of Indian, that is Calusa origin. The most suitable location for a colony would have been Pine Island, so that map is in here, plus some other maps that indicate that it originally was called Sanibel River, and the island was called South Nibel, or Nibel, South Flat. Very apt description of this island in those old days. Well, I've kind of worn you out, I guess, with the talk. Can I answer any questions?
The Indians that were here, have you decided which tribes they came from, were they Caribs or Arawaks?
Interesting question. No one's quite sure of that. They, I would say that, and Betty, you can jump in here too, that if you want. I think the most prevalent theory is that the Calusa came up from the Caribbean. They had some traits, some cultural traits, which were reminiscent of Central America. For instance, one of their big mounds, the one in Estero Bay, the big Mount Key down there, was stepped like a pyramid. It wasn't just a heaped up mound. Now further north, the mounds were just round. They generally had a spiral walkway to the top where there was a lodge where they apparently kept bones. They would strip the bones of flesh, allow the vultures to do this and decay. And the vulture was a totem. And then they would wrap the bones in deer skins and bury them in the mound. But those mounds, the ceremonial mounds, were round, except for the walkway, and were faced with shells, to be white. But the one here in Estero Bay was a stepped mound. Some of the artifacts that they found of the Calusa are reminiscent of Central American artifacts, and the drawings look very much like Central America. So there's a feeling that they came here from Central America. We do know that in Columbus, one of his first, I think it was either first or his second voyage, came across dugout canoes lashed side by side, which were on a trading mission across the Caribbean. So they crossed the Caribbean in dugout canoes regularly. So it's not an impossible thing for them to have done. North of Charlotte Harbor, the Indians were Timucua, and they eventually became Plains Indians. They were native North Americans. While we're on the Indians and who was here, I might digress at this point to tell you that the Seminoles were not an ancient Indian tribe in this area. Around 1700, 1702, around in there. First of all, there were a lot of slave raids from the southern plantations during the 16th century. In 1700 to 1702, there was a great plague in this area. And a lot of casual historians like to say, well, that was a smallpox when the white man brought over. No, it's not true. The white man did introduce smallpox, and it was devastating when it took hold. But in addition to that, they were subject to influenza epidemics just as we are today. During World War I, the great influenza epidemic of that period killed 25% of all the Americans. One out of four.
More people than the
Yeah,
war.
right.
Yeah.
Died from the influenza epidemic. And the Spaniards, when these epidemics would start, they were quite frightened because they thought it was the plague. Now they knew what smallpox was. You get these lesions on your face and your body. And the Indians were dying like flies, not from smallpox lesions, but from something they didn't understand. We have new strains of flu that come on just about every year. Every year is a new strain. And sometimes they're particularly virulent, and the Indians suffer from them just like we did. And so it's my theory. We're fairly sure that it's not smallpox, because the Spaniards knew what smallpox looked like. They didn't know what this was. So it's my theory, it was just an influenza epidemic. Anyway, it wiped out a very large portion of the Tamaqua and the Calusa. And the Calusa and the Tamaqua were always fighting with each other. Anyway, so there was suddenly this portion of this part of Florida was vacant. There was no one living here to contest or coming through. At about that same time in northern Florida and in southern Georgia, the Creek Indians had suffered a population explosion. And they finally said, hey, there's all that empty land down there. Why don't you young people go down there and take over? And so they did. And there was a conscious migration of Creek Indians into this part of the country that had been vacated by wars and by this plague that I told you about. And they were called those who go to distant places, Seminole. Creek Indian word Seminole, it means those who go to distant places.
What?
That's where the name came. So the Seminoles have been here since about early 1700s.
It suggested the capital of the Calusas was on islands.
It was either Usepa or Pine Island, and it probably was at one time or other was both, because the chief, cacique he was called, we call him the chief. The cacique means chief of chiefs, to be exact. And he had about 14 chiefs who reported to him, or as his vassals.
But this suggests a different kind of Indian, a water-based Indian.
Right. Well, the Calusa were, as I say, they were
Yes.
primarily water-based.
All right.
But the caciques moved around as the seasons changed and as matters of state dictated. Now, the Calusa were a very advanced, civilized Indian. They, despite these rather ugly religious practices they had and war practices, they also they practiced royal incest, for example. The chief always married his sister to keep the bloodline good. And but they would establish treaties with other nations in South Florida, and from whom they would exact tribute. They were centered very largely around Lake Okeechobee and around Miami. And they regularly had conferences and exacted tribute and signed treaties and had ambassadors back and forth. And, so they had developed a social structure very much like the European. They just didn't have the European technology. When I lived in Ohio, in a place called Wayne County, Worcester is the county seat. It's about 20 miles east of Akron. I belonged to the archaeology committee of the Wayne County Historical Society, and we did digs there like we do digs here. And one of the digs that we did inside the city limits of Worcester, Ohio, we dug up a cache of fossilized shark teeth. They only come from Minnesota Key. Black and black polished, little specks of red. Very definitive Minnesota Key. And yet we found them in Worcester, Ohio. So there were well-defined trade routes, and traders could pass from one tribe to another with impunity. They would not be attacked. They were very important. So if you were a trader, you could go through an enemy's territory, and he wouldn't attack you or hinder you in any way. So there was a very active and a very large and a very extensive trade amongst the Indians. We, for instance, find copper implements down here, and copper, there again, the metallurgical content of copper varies depending where you get it. It's slightly different all over the world. And we're able to determine that Lake Superior copper was used for ornaments down here in Florida. We know that obsidian from out west, where we find it here in tools. So the trade was over a very large area.
You mentioned these mounds a lot. You said used as ceremonial. What other purpose did they serve?
Burial. burial, and mostly, they're called domiciliary or dwelling mounds. And that was just sand heaped up till you got above the general overflow area or flooding area, and you put a house on it. And there were a lot of domiciliary mounds here, and I think Kelly has got one on your property, don't you, or you used to? You used to find artifacts out there right off of your house. Wasn't there a mound out there? Wasn't there a domiciliary mound out there?
Probably smaller mounds,
Yeah,
all along the
Yeah.
very shore.
They were domiciliary mounds. They were built to a hot and
That's part
abandoned,
of
yeah.
that.
And they melt back down on the ground pretty quick.
And then did he describe the two mounds, one was on the top of one was the house
And
with
we
the
carry up.
chief, and the other was the.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And he said that the lodge would hold 4,000 people. I doubt that. But anyway, that was what he said. Solis was the founder of the Menendez expedition, and he came, and he's another very fascinating character. I didn't write about him because he's been well documented, and if you're interested in, he gives you a better picture of the collusion, because he actually brought priests here. One of the things that he did was establish a system of mission forts, about 5 of them all around Florida, and the one on the west coast was San Antone. And we don't know where San Antone is. Some people think it was on Mount Key. There's a Mount Key up in Charlotte Harbor, which is also a cannon fort. But nobody really is for sure where San Antone was. And that was a colony which existed for about 2 years. But we can't be sure, and we'd like to find it. Now, there's a man up in Charlotte Harbor who thinks he knows where San Antone was. And San Antone did have a mission, and he had priests attached to it. We know the names of the priests, but Gasparilla Island was named for a friar, Gaspar. He was not a priest, he was a friar. And we have in Bernard Roman's map of 1755, the one that we in the book here, I'll show a slide of it. It shows Friar Gaspar Boca Friar Gaspar.
Wonderful.
And this was well before Gasparilla was supposed to have those all the shenanigans. And all the historians have been searching for Friar Gaspar. Illa is the Spanish suffix used as a diminutive. It's what you put on the name of a child or a beloved relative. Friar Gaspar was apparently beloved because they call him Gasparilla, beloved friar. But because he was a friar, we don't have any record of him. And but there's a man up in Charlotte Harbor. I'll tell you his name, Rick Vaughn. He helped in the early stages of recovering the treasure from the Tochet. He was a diver, and he thinks he has found San Antone up at Big Mount Key, up in Charlotte Harbor, and he thinks he has found the church's cache of silver, 9 tons of it. And he's got a permit to dig it. I think he's dead wrong, because he's got it in the play. I don't want to go into too many details. He's taken me to the site on 2 occasions, as a matter of fact, and showed me his magnetometer readings and all that sort of thing. And he's got something unusual, something very interesting. It's an anomaly. It shouldn't be where it is. But he's got $2.5 million sunk in it already, and he's trying to, and he needs a little more money. No, I'm sorry, not 2.5, I'm sorry. Quarter of $250,000. He's got $250,000 sunk in it. He thinks he can recover $6 million, but he's got to give 1/4 of that to the state. But at any rate, so the question of where is San Antone, and what's all this silver doing up there, we don't know. We've got a lot to learn in this business yet. We're running out of time, Mary.
Well, I think that there are people interested in your books, and maybe they should come on up here and buy them for you.
Lynn?
And I want to thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.